Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being with us throughout this entire weekend and all the way through the end. I'm Liana Gillooly. I just have had such a privilege of being a part of the production team of the conference this weekend, and none of this would be possible without all of you showing up for us in so many ways and showing up for MAPS and all the amazing work that's happening in the world, so thank you. Yeah. I just wanted to take this opportunity with all these incredible panelists here I'm going to ask just a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over to you, the audience. So think of your burning questions that you have for this fine panelist, because we'll have ample time to do that after I ask a few questions. So I'd like to start, hi friends, hi, by asking each of you, what are some of the key takeaways or insights that you've sat with or been with throughout this weekend, or what are some of the themes that you've seen emerge over our time together?
Okay, well, the perspective that I have is the importance of blending looking at science and looking at the data with looking at culture and public policy and the drug war. That we can have conferences that talk just about the science, but conferences that just talk about drug policy reform, but I really think they're enriched by both blending them together. And I hope that you all feel somewhat similar, that there's just a lot of implications from the science, and to not discuss them, I think, doesn't build as rich of a conference.
Thank you. Pass them over.
Like you said, Rick, there seems to be a theme of integrated community action. There's a desire amongst the participants with whom I've spoken to find ways to knit together all of these different elements of our work, making sure that people's voices are included authentically and brought into the considerations of these reforms, the research, the science, but ensuring that we aren't leaving anyone behind.
I am interested in the contrast between the use of pure molecules, single molecules, versus the complexity of natural products. I think indigenous peoples have shown, led the way, and I think that now I think there's evidence that we are gathering of the entourage effect and activating multiple receptor fields with the analogs of the psilocybin. And so that also speaks to the complexity of natural products, and that we have evolved in the natural landscape in contact with a multiplicity of molecules. And epigenetically, it makes sense to me. I understand the importance of standardization, but I think the entourage effects of natural products should be carefully reviewed to see if they can be standardized with iboga, ayahuasca, and psilocybin mushrooms, and that's something I think that has promise for the future. How we overcome the hurdles for that is another question.
Something that I've been excited to be hearing throughout this weekend are just all of these new ideas of ways to innovate in all different concepts, whether we're innovating the way we're doing research, what we're studying, how we're studying things, the way we're doing healthcare delivery, what kind of financial systems and models we're using to deliver care. And I think that we have a big responsibility as this community and an honor to be able to be innovating in so many different ways. And I'm excited to keep talking about that.
I'm just excited. I guess I'm just going to echo what Rick and others have said, that you all come from such a wide range of different sort of backgrounds, educational background, professional backgrounds, and you all are here meeting, talking, discussing, networking. That's one of the biggest takeaways that I see.
Thank you. So this is an extraordinarily dynamic and potent time right now for this movement. What is something happening right now that you notice across not only your own work, but across the field that has you either excited or perhaps maybe a little bit nervous?
Well, what seems to be happening from my perspective is that the FDA And regulators around the world are starting to really understand, based on the preliminary data that we've presented, based on the ways that the funding is showing up and the ways our phase 2 and phase 3 studies are going, that we might actually succeed. And that they're going to have to really address this question of how to regulate psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy post-approval as a prescription treatment once it starts to scale, and that's a real challenge. And so I have been thinking a lot. It's both anxiety-provoking and very exciting, but I think there's a certain level now at the FDA in particular of trying to grapple with the fact that the kind of standards they put into place now are likely to be what's going to happen post-approval, and that they really need to think about the cultural impacts. And it's happening at the same time that the FDA is very much under, in some cases, justifiable criticism for what's been happening with the opiate crisis and other, the way that driven by the profit motive, driven by for-profit pharmaceutical companies, driven by all across the line, from the distributors, from the pharmacies, that got way out of control. And so we have to demonstrate how we propose that psychedelics become medicalized and scaled, but do it in a responsible way. And so I think that's the real challenge that I see right now. Over the next couple months, we'll be engaging in a bunch of negotiations with FDA about requirements of therapists, about ideas for how to move this forward. And so it's both in a very exciting time, but a very delicate, because we're going to be setting the foundations for years to come.
I do find it very compelling to think about how we can leverage this moment, this psychedelic renaissance, this moment where we have articles in the New York Times and people like Michael Pollan writing books and conversations around dinner tables, into a profound cultural shift in the way that we approach people and drugs and the people who use them. I'm very much interested in how we go about using this time, both to advance policy toward justice, toward human rights, but also how we use this time to educate the public at large. I mean, listen, I am a drug user. The drug with which I have a problem is caffeine. Oh. And if we can start talking about, substances and the ways that we use them ourselves, the ways that we see them in communities, and start to really make that shift so that we are thinking holistically about how these substances affect our lives, then I think that we can start to approach some of the problems that feel intractable with creativity, innovation, and ideas like, making drug checking widespread and available, and eventually, long-term building toward more fundamental changes in the ways that we're approaching people's relationship with drugs, instead of thinking that, every time someone uses this thing, it is this. Understanding that really it's about my relationship with the substance and how that is managed.
Well, I have two remarks. One is, as Rick mentioned, there's now in the FDA science before politics, and I think Rick has done a lot in order to facilitate that sea change. I think they've been waiting for somebody like Rick to come along with credible evidence and good intentions and integrity. So I could see that as a fundamental change within the FDA. They want to help if you give them the right tools and reason and justification for doing so. That is really, really different than the war on drugs during the Nixon administration. That's one thing that I note. The biggest concern that I have is the pump and dumpers. These are the vulture capitalists that are coming into the scene, trying to capitalize purely for financial purposes. Even one of the members of the Shark Tank, literally, is becoming an investor. And these people are not imbued by the spirit and reverence of these psychedelics and these mushrooms. They don't see the long-term view. They're looking at being able to come into the scene, and what I expect, and there's probably some of them here right now who are keeping quiet, to be able to see what's happening in the psychedelic scene so they can mine information, and they'll look for opportunities and vulnerabilities. And what I suspect will happen in the next 2 years, you're going to see a half a dozen or a dozen competing companies who are already now seducing experts to get them involved, and the tables will turn. Once they see the vulnerabilities and they can exploit a vulnerability of an organization, they will do so purely for monetary purposes because that's what motivates them. I think we all should be alert to that.
Well, thank you. And I guess continuing along that, when I'm thinking of what I'm excited about this year, I'm thinking about the clinics that are forming, looking forward to MDMA approval, forming to do ketamine therapy. And the clinics that I'm most inspired by are those that are building slowly with intention and not those that are, scaling for the investors that are lining up. And I do want to invite those investors. We know, that is what is going to be driving this forward, but to come with intention and to see what we are supporting, what we are growing, and that some of the slowest growth in this space can really be the most fertile ground for healing. And I think that balance will be a really interesting way forward. And I'm really excited about seeing all different ways of navigating in that area. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm excited to be here, but I'm more of a half empty kind of glass person. That's why I hang out with Rick, because he's the opposite. So I want to share my concern. My biggest concern is that I have less number of years to live than I've already lived. So I will die. And drugs will still be illegal as a result of less than smarter people than me in pharmacology keeping them illegal. That's my biggest concern. My biggest concern is that I can't use the substances that I like to use, and I'm forced to use for recreational purposes, alcohol. And being a pharmacologist is kind of insulting. No disrespect for people who use alcohol, that's fine. When I was younger, it was great. But as you get older, there are other things you learn. So I think about the folks who were the revolutionaries who began the country. One of their concerns were that, particularly the smart, wealthy people, they were concerned that they were being led by people who were unfair and who were less than smarter than them. And so they had a revolution. And so that's my concern, is how do I start a revolution to...
Yeah. Thanks for that, Carl. I, for one, will join any revolution that you start. Yeah. So I'd like to actually throw a curveball to my panelists here and say that here at MAPS, we often refer to all of you as our community. And as we move forward and move this culture forward, it's up to us to further define who we are as a culture. And so my question to all of you is, what do you think are some of the core qualities that ethical and responsible psychedelic community could embody? And what would you encourage each person in this room to embody if they are choosing a pathway of working with these medicines in their lives?
Well, first, Carl, I just want to say that I think the revolution has already started. And I think we deserve, the CIA deserves a lot of credit for dosing Ken Kesey and others 50 years ago and sparking kind of a revolution in consciousness that it's now taken us 50 years to overcome the backlash and start to make more progress. But I think the sense that I have about what the community is, that it's incumbent upon us to recognize, and I thought Melody said it really well, the other day, that you think about people who are motivated by fear, people who are motivated by anxiety, people who are motivated by hate or by othering and by, circling the wagons and trying to hold on to white supremacy, that those are part of the community too, and that we really need to reach out to them. I think we need to think a lot about how do we help people deal with the anxieties and the fears that are making them easily manipulatable, and how do we help them feel healthier and stronger and more spiritual. So we might think in our own community that we need to break down this us and them of the psychedelic community and others. I think the idea that we saw from the panel about the use among soldiers with PTSD, with war-related PTSD, Amber talking about her as a Christian. I think that it's really incumbent upon us to realize that what we're trying to do is to help everybody. And when we talk about the mystical experience as being something that connects us to everybody, we really need to think about who we're trying to help and who we're trying to include. And so we want to reach out to those people that are suffering the most. So if I think we sort of aim ourselves at where the most pain and suffering is, and it's spread all over, how do we actually bring tools of healing, tools of hope to those people that we might think are on the other side of these divides? I think that's incumbent upon us to really make that our own personal mission, and that's what's going to really make it so that the society this time really does mainstream psychedelics, and they're not rejected as some kind of counterculture effort that has to be thrown out. And there's an enormous amount of pain and suffering everywhere we look, and I think that's really got to be, in a way, our North Star. Where do we go? And we need to include everybody in that.
Thanks.
If we're going to engage in healing, we must first engage in taking an unflinching look at what has come before and how we have participated in it. I think that it's terrifically important that we examine our own participation in the systems that have cause societal level trauma, both in the past and in the present, that we are extraordinarily good listeners, constantly engaging in Socratic dialogue with ourselves and others, and making sure that we're holding ourselves accountable for the ways that we stand in community with each other. Those are some of the things that I think are going to ensure that we can build a community that goes beyond an us and a them. We have to do the work of repair first for ourselves and with the people with whom we interact. We must be inviting. And I will quote, I believe, Emma Goldman, or paraphrase Emma Goldman, and say, it's not my revolution if it doesn't have dancing. So let's make sure we keep on dancing.
Well, I'm really encouraged to see that the politically conservative powers that be, the Mercer's funded maps, this reaching, we need to create bridges between the communities where there's such great chasms. And now the realization by these learned conservatives who understand that psychedelics are not the same thing as opiates, and the opioid crisis is affecting all families throughout our country and other countries, that the fact that we can build these new bridges of communication and that these psychedelics fundamentally change people and make them into nicer people, I think that's something that Christians and Muslims and Jewish people all hold in common. So I'm hoping that the psychedelic movement, as we're seeing today, and the vast, enormous interest, people are hungry for a positive change that builds bridges and not burns them. And I think the psychedelic bridges that are being made today are unprecedented, and it's something that we need to fortify and to encourage and support in every way that we can.
Amen to rainbow psychedelic bridges. I mean, when you ask what characteristics come to mind when I think of the psychedelic community, similar to what you were ending with, is I really just thought of compassion and loving kindness. and thinking about a term we use in MDMA therapy about the inner healing intelligence and kind of connecting into your inner healing intelligence and seeing how often that leads to compassion and to loving kindness and to also to respect this intelligence both within and without. And I think something I've been quite encouraged by to see with the movement for environmental action recently, to see so much of the psychedelic community also really feel connected and recognize the sources of all of these medicines and the connection throughout. So I see psychedelics, the psychedelic embodiment in that ability to connect us to our inner power and to the power throughout. And I really believe one of the reasons psychedelics have such tremendous healing capacity is because they allow us to realize that we ourselves are capable of healing, and it's not really something external, it's really our own process and our own intelligence.
Yeah.
I really hate to speak after Natalie's beautiful words because I absolutely agree with her. But I have to say something related to opioids. So I was recently the chair of my department for the past 3 years at an Ivy League institution. And if you know anything about faculty at the in the Ivy League institutions, you know we are entitled people, right? And as a chair, dealing with entitled people can be difficult. And when we're talking about these bridges that psychedelics help us to build, help us to be more magnanimous and those sorts of things. Heroin did that for me. Otherwise, I might have strangled someone. And so the notion that opioids are different or opioids can't do these kind of things, that's nonsense. And so I just want to make that clear here today. When we start to separate these drugs like that, we're engaging in this sort of drug elitism or psychedelic elitism, and that's not what we're doing when we're building bridges. And so I just hope you understand that heroin made me a better person.
Thank you. So I have one final question for this esteemed panel, which is, there's so much happening, it's so dynamic. So imagine for a moment that 5 years from now, we are all sitting together. Where are we? Where are we as a movement? What is different? What has changed? And what forks in the road might have appeared that could have taken us one way or another?
Okay, so 5 years from now is near the end of 2024. We anticipate FDA approval for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, end of 2021, middle of 2022, sometime in there. I think psilocybin is likely to be approved as a medicine for treatment-resistant depression, sometime also around 2022, 2023. I think we're going to have a lot more marijuana legalization initiatives on the ballot in 2020 in multiple states, and we might even be, by 2024, have the federal government say that it's up to the states to set their own policies for marijuana, the same way we did with alcohol. I think we'll have Canada will have demonstrated marijuana legalization for multiple years. And so I think we'll be in a whole different world as far as the mainstreaming of both recreational use of marijuana and also medical use of psychedelics. And I think we'll have more examples like Oakland and like Denver and perhaps like the state of Oregon, where we'll have new new policies towards access to psychedelics, to plant medicines. So I think that we will probably be gathering together at one of the events that Paul has described earlier, all doing psychedelics together and celebrating what we've accomplished. And I think that the forks in the road are going to be really the extent to which we can fundamentally address the fears of the FDA and the culture and put in safeguards in how we grow this this movement and this medical use, and also the decriminalization, deprioritization initiatives, and that we put into place harm reduction methods, drug checking methods, and the fork in the road that's really important for me. And it's also something we've talked about. Paul, you sort of talked about the profit motive and the venture capitalists. I think that there's a lot of benefits also from, you know, for-profit development, but it has to be where it's not like the way it was with the opiate epidemic, where profit above all. I think you can have mission-driven, ethical, for-profit distribution of psychedelics, and we have to sort of be on the alert that both the for-profits and the non-profits stay focused on the mission, which is mass mental health and, you know, fairness and equity. And if we can do that, if we go down the road of just medicalizing psychedelics where profit above all, then I think we may be mourning 5 years from now from where we're at. And I just want to say, I think, Carl, what you just said is so important, that it's not really about, I do think, you know, opiates do different things than psychedelics. I just had a colonoscopy a couple days ago. It was my standard coloscopy, and you get fentanyl as part of it. And as I came out of it, I was like, wow, this feels really good. Maybe I won't wait so long for my next colonoscopy. So I think that really we have to recognize that it's not about the drug, it's about the relationship with the drug, and that the psychedelics can also be harmful, and people can have bad experiences and end up worse. So I think we, as a culture, that this I see as the key fork in the road, and the key problem with the drug war is we invest certain drugs. These are good drugs, these are bad drugs, and we lose the fact that it's entirely about the relationship that we develop between us and the substance that determines whether it's good or bad. And it's about that fork in the road that we hopefully will make a successful transition, and the society really will look a whole lot better in the end of 2024.
I hope that by the end of 2024, we will have long convinced Rick that, in fact, allowing drugs to be distributed in for-profit models is less than ideal, and that we should be looking at other economic models like the pollination method, like B Corps, which, of course, recognizing the MAPS Corp, but that there are very compelling reasons to look to cooperative economic models and new economic models as a way to ensure that we are building new systems by which we can start to examine that relationship more closely, rather than allow profit incentives to be part of that work. I hope very much that by that time, we will have seen some of these interesting new strategies that are starting to emerge around strategic litigation, civil disobedience, right to try laws, and others have expanded access to harm reduction, have expanded access to the tools that we find so valuable, and have caused us to stop criminalizing people for what they choose to put into their bodies, that we have legalized people. And I hope very much at that point that we are taking a really hard look at how we address problems that we now perceive as drug problems and acknowledge them as drug prohibition problems, and really start to take a more careful look at that from a public health model.
In 5 years, is that what you said? Mm-hmm. I think the Decriminalize Oakland movement is a template for all across cities, the United States and elsewhere, I think the citizen-based initiatives, especially working with city councils and removing all public funding for prosecution of people in possession of natural products containing, drug-like compounds and/or drugs. I think that type of citizen initiative is a grassroots, a mycelial network that is just connecting and coming up from the underground. I see that as something that I think portends of what I hope to be a revolution of myco-warriors spreading across the planet to be able to heal environments and also be able to use mushrooms as healing medicines for the soul. And I think that what I have noticed is that mycelium has become the zeitgeist of our time. It's more than a metaphor. It is an actionable, understandable way of communities bonding together that can affect, change that is measurable, that has measurable benefits. And what I would hope to see in 5 years is that there is a substantial reduction in depression, in suicides from PTSD, and it all emanates from conferences like this. And I think that this is just the beginning. I've been speaking on this subject for a very long time. I've never seen such a surge in interest that I see today. It is, these conferences sell out, extremely quickly. We can't get venues large enough. And I think that's symptomatic of the fact that people realize that these are actionable solutions that are credible scientifically and can be put into motion. So.
I'm also really encouraged by this sweeping wave and excited and optimistic that in 5 years, this wave of movement for decriminalization will also join forces with this growing wave for decriminalization of all drugs. And I really believe when these forces join together in 5 years, no problem. Let's hope no one will be being arrested for any drug crimes.
Yeah.
Let's also hope in 5 years that people have access to these medicines in therapeutic contexts, and people, we talk about alternative models, and I want to just name some things out there, that these clinics might have tiered access systems, so some people have no cost and some people pay what they can pay and pay a bit more. Let's also name systems like, we were just speaking earlier about in Catalonia in Spain, they have cannabis social clubs, right, where they're community-based spaces where people go to get medicine. And I think that this model is really key in the psychedelic context because community integration is really so essential and for learning. And imagine, I'd love to imagine what a social club might look like with a farm, growing mushrooms, cannabis, tomatoes, also having space, having doctors being able to prescribe heroin and other substances, having safe consumption sites, connecting this all together. Should there be safe consumption sites for one set of drugs and not for another? And what does it mean to have this as a community space, and how much healing and learning comes from community? We know peer education is really the key to drug education. So when you're learning from your peers in that context, I think that will be one of the key ways to reduce potential harms and the way that I think we need to be integrating these substances into our society.
Yeah.
I really can't add anything to Natalie's comments nor Betty's comments, so I'm going to pass the mic back down so you guys can ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Okay, audience, we are ready for you. Do we have any hands, and do we have our mic runners?
Hi, in the middle here. So, really grateful for all of this scientific information. I've been learning so much today. And hearing a lot about integrating indigenous ways of life and respecting them. And I also personally have a ginormous love of all life that is beyond human life that I can't even quantify. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on how we use animals to further our own science in this field, and how do we make peace with that or give respect to them and just work with that?
Well, I'll start because we have actually been required to do some animal studies. And I think that the trade-off is either refuse to do them, try to change the whole drug development system, which is not going to happen for a very long time, and not make progress, or go ahead with the animal studies and then honor and respect the animals. We did the first animal study actually in 1985 with dogs and rats. And I happened to have a dream about that map. This was right before I started MAPS, the nonprofit before that. And I had a dream about the dogs that were being sacrificed in our study. And so I felt like I should go and observe them to make sure that they were being taken care of properly. And so it just so happened coincidentally that I went to see the lab. It was the National Center for Toxicological Research in Jefferson, Arkansas. I happened to go there the day that they were euthanizing a bunch of the dogs. And then I thought maybe I should change my trip, but I thought, no, that's the day I should really be there. And so I saw something that was very sacred about science. There was this moment where these dogs, which I saw were well cared for, although they had to live in cages and they weren't really like your pet dogs, but that they were given a drug. They keeled over and died in a fraction of a second, it looked like, and then they were immediately taken to, there was 4 different tables and different people autopsying them all at the same time and cutting up their bodies and weighing the different parts. And I stood in the middle of them and just shared stories of MDMA therapy, so these people would know why it was that we were doing it. And I felt that there was this mystery of life and death when these animals died that was bigger than this whole scientific apparatus. And it was something feeble and pathetic in a way about our human effort to understand what's going on. And yet I felt there was something sacred about it, about our effort to try to remove subjectivity and see what's really there. And what really was left with me is that the way to honor these animals that have died in order to help us work through these systems is to use that data as much as we can in order to make these drugs available to heal people, so that people will then have much more appreciation for all of the life on planet and then try to save the nature and save the planet. So I think the answer to that question, at least the way I've answered it, is that it's essential. We should do what is required of us, but we need to do it with as few animals as possible, with as little misery as possible, and then use the data as much as we can, as hard as we can, to get these healing potentials into human hands. If anybody else wants to respond.
Hey, y'all. Really appreciate the insightful commentary all throughout the weekend. My question is really regarding the evolution of drug consumption. That is MDMA or other types of research chemicals ever going to be integrated into the psychedelic community? Right? Research chemicals like all the 4-HOs and 5-HO, tryptamine compounds, psilocybin analogs, because I feel like for the evolution of the species, you need the evolution of the drug consumption itself. Could any of y'all speak on these psilocybin analogs or the potential for research chemicals? Thank you.
I just want to call attention to one thing here, and then I'll let an expert on this issue talk about it. But there are approximately 100 new novel psychoactive substances introduced into the market every year because of drug prohibition. They are replacements for drugs like MDMA and psilocybin and LSD, drugs with known safety profiles and a deep understanding of their impact on humans. And because of prohibition, these substances are working around a legal status and far more dangerous, or carry far more risk, certainly because they are unknown and for many other reasons than these known substances. And we must be very careful when we're thinking about questions around legalization and prohibition, about how prohibition in fact drives drugs to become more potent, less well known, and riskier for the user. And I hope that we will all be very careful when we're talking about what we are legalizing and what we are not, and what we are decriminalizing and what we are not, and considering that these novel psychoactive substances are fundamentally probably unnecessary. So I'll pass the mic to someone who knows more about. Does anyone want to talk about analogs?
No. Okay, we can stick with that.
Well, I'm on the path of exploring analogs, and tomorrow we get a cascade of data from a laboratory in France that tests compounds preclinically to test for their toxicity, as well as their neurogenic potential, looking at pluripotent stem cells and brain-derived nerve growth factors and also nerve growth factors. So the evidence that we've seen thus far preliminarily is encouraging. So I think there are ways of eliciting neurogenesis without necessarily people getting high from it. And some of these analogs are perfectly legal. But it's way, way early in this process. And the evidence has not been built. It's just basically just beginning these experiments. But I am a little bit disturbed. I got a phone call about 3 weeks ago from DARPA. And DARPA has put out a solicitation to create to look at analogs of psychoactive substances that could be used for treating PTSD. And I talked to the physician at length for a long time. And the word kept coming up that was very disturbing to me. This is for the warfighter environment. We're trying to support the warfighters. Warfighters, warfighters, over and over again. Warfighters, warfighters. And I thought, this is really disturbing. DARPA is involved in disruptive technologies. They putatively said that they want to create the anti-pharma. They want to disrupt the pharmaceutical industry. Well, that sounded interesting. But the more I pushed back on this, the more I felt like I was dancing with the devil. Now, DARPA has done some good things, right? They actually have. And they've done a lot of bad things. But I think their interest in the subject in some ways it validates that the science is there. The potential for scientific benefit is there, for therapeutic benefit. But in the context of just wanting to use it in the warfighter environment, totally turned me off. So that's it.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Well, thank you so much for taking questions at this time. So I've heard it said, and I'm sure many of you have heard as well, this said oftentimes in jest. Closer? Okay, thank you. So I've heard, many of you had heard this joke. We've been born too late to explore the world, which maybe not true, but and born too early to explore this physical universe. But we've been born just in time to explore interdimensional hyperspace. Now, obviously, I'm being somewhat facetious, but I think that there is a kernel there that I think has mainstream cultural appeal. And I think that if we can unify around anything, it's around that value of exploration and experimentation. And I think you see this with, how popular Terence McKenna is, or was. So I'm just wondering what you guys have to suggest would be a new label for this, because it's commonly referred to, I think, as psychonautics, but I think that has a predominantly negative connotation among our culture, given that psycho is associated with psychosis and a whole host of other negative ways of interacting with our own minds. And so the question, again, just to restate it, is if you had to suggest a new label for psychonautics or for the exploration of consciousness, what might you suggest? And thank you again.
Human? What I've got, but perhaps someone else.
No.
Well, I'll just say that my view of this is that we need to, I like the word psychonaut. We just published Stan's book, The Way of the Psychonaut. I think that the same what we've tried to do with the word psychedelic. When I first started MAPS in '86, and I specifically wanted to use the word psychedelic. So I think the same way that gay rights have taken the word queer, we need to change the cultural connotations with the word more than I think we need to change the word itself. And so I think we've done a lot of that with psychedelic. That was hedonistic, party, crazy, and now I think psychedelic is more associated with healing. So I think this idea of exploring inner space, of really being adventuresome and courageous to explore the psyche. So there's a lot of different connotations with that word, and I think we just need to really try to make more positive connotations rather than try to find a different word.
Hi there. I first wanted to say that I'm very humbled to be here today. This is the very last minute. I was on the wait list till literally Friday. So very excited, very humbled. I appreciate everybody. So there is an obvious connection between psilocybin and spirituality. My question came up during the last lecture. I was curious to know if anyone had any knowledge or opinion over the hypothesis that the ingestion of psilocybin has resulted in visions that may have influenced organized religion. I know that Native American church has been influenced by peyote, so I don't see why not psilocybin may be the forbidden fruit. Mm-hmm. Who knows?
You should say something.
I teach these workshops, and there's one workshop that I taught. This very quiet man came up to me, and he waited till I was alone, and he came to me and he goes, "I'm a devout Christian, and I work directly with Billy Graham." And he wanted me to know that the inner circle of Billy Graham, a very well-known Christian religious leader, that members of his inner circle of 8 had come to deepen their religious faith through psilocybin. And they consider this to be very important. My mother was a charismatic Christian. I've met several other individuals who are now quote-unquote drug-free, but they also came to a deepening of their religious beliefs through psilocybin. I think we saw some evidence of that even today. So I feel that's an extraordinary thing, is that people are recognizing that these substances can make them more spiritual, whether it's Christianity or some other religion, but that sort of that deep appreciation for life and for each other. I think that these substances are important for within many of these religious communities. So I was pretty surprised by that. I'm going to offend a lot of people here. But sometimes I meet good Christians, you know. So why? Because there are some bad Christians who have just suspended their morals, their ethics, to support people who lie, who create divisions, who are prejudiced, who deepen the divides in our society and foment hate. I don't see those individuals as walking that Christian path. I grew up in a highly Christian environment, and I can say that with some authority. But when I meet these individuals who are humble, who are concerned about the poor, who are volunteering, and who are walking their talk, then I have infinitely more respect for them. But unfortunately, I think with many conventional religions, it's a predator-prey relationship. And I've seen this happen all my young adult life, where there basically were predators within the religious community exploiting the vulnerable. So unfortunately, that occurs. But I do see these substances as deepening people's respect for each other. And whatever religion you put behind that, that doesn't matter to me. The fact that people become better at communicating and they're better in their empathy, I think is a net bonus for society.
Yeah. To Natalie.
Recently, I've actually been exploring mentions of plant medicine in the Old Testament or the Torah. And actually, Canabasim, or cannabis, and im is plural in Hebrew, is talked about being used in the old temple, for example, and burned. It's often translated in English as a fragrant blossom. So there's also a lot of really interesting theories around DMT, which is found in acacia in the region, inspiring stories like the burning bush or many other elements of different biblical stories. And there really is reason to believe, at least in the old temples, they would burn really an assortment of different coals and involving different plants that seem to really create a powerful spiritual experience. And it's been really exciting talking to different rabbis and trying to better understand that. But I definitely think there's something there.
Thanks.
So I just want to briefly you talked about the burning bush. So there was a Israeli psychologist who did a lot of studies about ayahuasca, and then he was the head of cognitive psychology at the Hebrew University. He wrote a paper about how Moses was high when he saw the burning bush. And so this paper was very controversial, but it was reported all over the world, including in the New York Times. So I went to my father and I said, "This is great. Look, my whole life has been validated. You know, Moses was on psychedelics, you know, when he saw the burning bush." And so my dad said, "Well, in order for me to believe in that, first off, I'd have to believe in Moses." So that's Reform Judaism for you.
Yeah. All right. So we are out of time, but I do see hands up. So I think we'll do maybe one or two more questions from the audience. If people feel like they're down. How do we feel right now, audience? Are we down for a couple more? Okay. All right. So if we could get, I'm not sure. Do we have any microphones?
She's going to do Q&A right now. They need to go back. She's been on Q&A. Okay. Well, they need to go out now.
Okay. Can some, no microphones. Okay. Maybe you can stand up and shout. Go for it. You've had your hand up.
So, number one, these past days have changed my life. Thank you so much for making this a reality and helping every single person here and eventually the world. So I have a question that's directed towards all of you. I hear the word consciousness, like shifting consciousness, changing consciousness. And so my name is Drew, by the way, and I study at the University of Central Florida, and I study neuroscience. So when I hear shift in consciousness, open consciousness, how are you framing that word? How are each of you making that and addressing that? Because my perception might be different from yours and every single other person's in this room.
Okay. Well, I'll just say very briefly that I think it's, for me, the way I use that, this shift in consciousness, it's a shift between the ego, the individual self, which is normally for us in the foreground. It's a shift from the foreground to the background, and then the foreground becomes our shared collective consciousness. And so I think it's the same kind of Galileo-Copernican shift, where the Earth was the center of the universe, and then the shift, no, the Earth revolves around the sun. So it's a similar kind of shift in consciousness, just this foreground, background, where we become realizing that each of us as individuals is really rotating around this big collective.
I would like to invite you to join your local SSDP chapter at your school, where they are having this kind of conversation all the time.
I am absolutely convinced that we are seeing only a thin slice of reality. And the more that we use these substances, the more that I'm impacted by the fact there's a greater reality, that the psilocybin in particular, LSD, and these other entheogens open up. And I think that a lot of us share this to realize, oh my gosh, there's so much more out there, but everything's filtered down and reduced. And that once you understand that existence has such, not boundless, but way beyond our visual acuity of what is normalized. And when you are following the developments in astrophysics and the mathematical probability of multiverses and what's happening, I'm seeing the day that these psychedelic substances are going to be able to be portals for us to taken and to be able to see existence on a level that is way beyond our current perception. I see these as something that opens up really, truly, as Aldous Huxley said, the doors of perception. I think there's a lot more out there, and because of evolution, because of the immediacy of survival, we've narrowed our field of receptors to take in the data that's immediately necessary. Now that we have the luxury of technology and we live longer and we have food support systems, I think that these substances have an opportunity for us to see a reality that is way beyond the conventions that we're currently employing.
Okay.
Question. I'll just quickly say, when I think of the word consciousness, I really think of awareness, and I don't think of it only, in psychedelic concepts, but the feminists used to have consciousness-raising circles to learn about patriarchy and all of the ways that it, is so entrenched. And so I really think it's about awareness of ourselves, of nature, of others, and in that expansion of consciousness, it's an expansion just of awareness and presence. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so this is truly now our final question. Go for it.
Okay. Hey. Okay, so I'm a mother. I have 2 boys, and I'm super involved in this as much as I can be, but I guess I have fears about the legality issues around it in regards to my kids. And so, 1, what is the best way for me to be involved? 2, how can I best foster this consciousness in my children as well?
How old are your kids?
7-year-old boy and 2.
Oh, wow. So you have 16 years before the children's services will stop messing with you. I see.
That's what I'm saying.
Wow, that's a difficult question because it's one that I had to face too in terms of coming out of the closet. I had children and I wanted to, and I also testify in court on behalf of women who have had their children taken because they have tested positive for cannabis or something. So that's a really difficult question because on the one hand, you are teaching your children how to be dishonest if they know their mother takes illegal psychoactive substances. And then on the other hand, you have to be dishonest in order to make sure that they stay in your possession. It's a hard thing for me to advise anybody to do. And that's something that you have to come to the conclusion yourself. But for me, it became too damn hard being treated like a child in yet another domain of my life, being a black man in America, in which you are relegated to child status, childlike status in so many other domains. And so I said, while I still had a child who was underage, I said, fuck it. I'll make it a big issue if I get harassed by children's services because I had accomplished and was accomplishing so many things in my professional life. How can you mess with me when I am a pillar of my community and I happen to use these other drugs? But that was a personal decision because I couldn't take it anymore. It was causing me too much mental anguish. And so I think that's really the question that you have to face. How much will you reveal? How active you will be in the community? And how much cognitive dissonance it causes you? But that's one that I think only you can answer.
if I could rewrite my childhood, what I would do is this. I would have had my parents had real and honest conversations with me from a very young or fairly young age about, in particular, my father's cannabis use and his earlier psychedelic use, but certainly about the ways in which I was being lied to by society, and they knew it. And they would be having age-appropriate conversations with me from, you know, as soon as I had a concept of what alcohol was, as soon as I had a concept of what coffee was, as soon as I had a concept of what any of these things were, they would have been telling me, you know, in this one area, you're not hearing everything that you need to, because they told me that about everything else that I was learning, particularly history and culture, in the ways that it wasn't telling the full story. They should have done it there too. And there are resources for that. The Safety First program from the Drug Policy Alliance, the Just Say No program from SSDP, and other qualified programs that are being developed worldwide, specific to geopolitical contexts and sociopolitical contexts. And that doesn't mean you necessarily need, you know, it was probably about right that I was 14 when I found out that my father was consuming cannabis. But it wouldn't have been devastating if I had known that I was lied to. It was devastating because I also found out that I had been lied to that day by everyone about these substances. So even if you're not saying, and I use this, making sure that you are having those conversations with your children early about the structures that are oppressive in the drug war and the ways that the information they're getting might not be the right information will at least equip them for that moment when they contend with the notion that you might be using those substances yourself. And will equip them to make the right choices when they're confronted about whether or not they're going to use them. And that is the most powerful thing that you can give them.
Yeah.
So because of my work, obviously it would be it was very important for my wife and I to be clear with our children. So the way we approached it is from a very, very young age, we taught them about civil disobedience and about how what's moral and what's legal are two different things. And you can't judge if something's illegal, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Women didn't used to be able to vote, you know, all sorts of terrible laws. So I think from a very young age, we started talking to them about this idea of their own inner moral compass, and that's potentially different than what is legal or not. The other thing that we did was really, really fun. I really loved the idea of getting high and reading bedtime stories. So, you know, for all you parents out there, you know you got to read the same story 100 times. And by the 50th time, it's rather boring, for you at least, not for the kids. But if you're really high when you're reading these stories, you're like, wow, look at that bird and that tree and that picture. What is that bird thinking? And so it's like dialogic reading. So, you know, the getting high and reading bedtime stories. So whenever at the end of the day when my kids are young and they would smell something as I was smoking pot, for them it was a real exciting moment. That was the transition to family time. And then the other time, right, yeah, and I've also talked about how my bar mitzvah failed to turn me into a man, and that's what drove me to psychedelics. So I recognize that when each of our kids turned 13, my wife and I said to them, we think now you're old enough to be asking these kind of questions about spirituality, about where you fit in, this rites of passage. And so we'd like you to know that if you want MDMA or marijuana, you should come to us and we'll give it to you and we could do it together. And as it turned out, all three of our kids said, oh my God, we're not ready. We don't want to do drugs with our parents. So it turned out to be the best possible anti-drug strategy, is you just offer it to your kids and they run the other way. And then later, as they got older, a few years later, they did come to us, and some of that was very beautiful experiences. So I think it's one of the worst parts of the drug war is this lying to your children. and influencing how you live inside your own little family home. And the war on drugs is getting you to warp how you teach your children. So I think we just have to throw that off and have this somehow or other honest dialogue in the families.
Yeah. Done. All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up one more time for Rick Doblin, Betty Aldworth, Stamets, Natalie